Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining me once again on GB News Originals. My guest today is Nick Hudson, a good friend of mine from South Africa, private equity investor, but also a polymath, interested in so much, and we have many excellent conversations together. Looking forward to this one. Thanks for joining me, Nick.
Pleasure. Great to be here.
Now, I'm interested in talking to you today specifically on the basis of a speech that you gave last month in Cape Town. And if it was in my gift so to do, I would laminate it and circulate it as an ideal summary of the situation in which we find ourselves. I think it's a summary of what of so much of what the general populace really needs to be aware of. You open by saying distortion of reality by tightly controlled media and highly censored social media and by actor politicians has become so intense that most people have disconnected from reality on many dimensions. Democracy has long been dysfunctional with manipulation of electoral results and control of candidates for election, making a mockery of democratic processes, and the roles of unelected officials coming to dominate those of the elected ones. In this environment, vast and completely fabricated narratives have been successfully launched upon unsuspecting populations. Now, if that isn't the foundation for a dystopia, I don't know what is. I wonder if you'd care to elaborate somewhat on where your mind was when you were writing that and telling your audience as much.
Well, thank you for the compliment regarding the speech. It really was um, an effort to speak without any regard for the Overton window. I was invited to talk at this seminar. It was being attended by many international speakers, including Senator Paul and Congressman Massey. And I looked at the opportunity and started thinking about what will the audience sustain? What will they be able to deal with? And then I thought, no, to hell with it. I'm going no holds barred. I'm going to just paint the picture of the world according to Nick Hudson. And that introduction really does cover it for me. I've come to the conclusion that it's probably never been the case that democracy has functioned as advertised.
This is that could well summarise my greatest shattering discovery, I suppose, in recent years. That because it simply summarises that the institutions which the likes of you and I were raised to trust are disingenuous at best and utterly false at worst. It's like suddenly finding yourself with no handrails, no banisters, nothing to hold on to. All of the things that you thought were there to support you as you went about your daily life, those supports are non-existent, and in fact, we're in free fall. You summarize, you talk about it's in respect to COVID, climate change, central banking, immigration, war, and even down to such things as trans rights. It does not matter whether the situation reflects planning on the part of a shadowy elite or is emergent from the decline of your civilization. No matter whom you vote for or what gloss your preferred candidate puts on these issues, nothing will change until you and enough of the people around you wake up to reality and launch a campaign of consistent non-compliance with the anti-human trajectory that manipulative elites have set us upon. This is some of a clarion call that we're hearing, are we not? More and more, and from more and more people around the world. That blunt realization has descended for so many people now.
Yeah, my friend Mike Driver, who I know I've introduced you to, puts it very well. He says, even when a politician is speaking the truth, he does so in service of a greater lie. And I think that's a proposition that many people would have actually readily accepted not too long ago. We all regarded politicians as perpetual liars and self-serving and manipulative. The spin that I think probably wasn't prevalent 10 years ago was the idea that they do not serve their communities or their populations, the citizens of the countries they ostensibly lead at all, and that they act in response to the preferences and motives of this parasitic elite, as I describe them.
Something that really, I suppose, sharpened or crystallized my general disquiet in what you had to say really related to Donald Trump, President Trump. That for so many people, his coming was supposed to herald something different. I was always I was always cynical. I found him highly entertaining, certainly, and I thought he was a disruptive element. But I didn't really think that he could, or that anyone could do what he was professing that he would do. But you now say that we've had the better part of a year of Donald Trump 2.0, and look what he has actually done. And in relation to the surveillance tech that's being rolled out in the States, that's simply a reflection of that greater global rollout of technocracy.
Yeah, I mean, you used the term entertaining, and that's exactly what actors do. And this is not to say that the person in the presidency has no power. They have a great deal of power in terms of their ability to influence the populace. So, for example, I had the occasion to have dinner with Congressman Massey on the fringes of that conference. And while we were having dinner, Trump was indulging in a massive attack against Massey, one of the most consistently electable and popular congressmen in the House. And the reason for this was, multifold. He's taken a critical line about AIPAC, and he's taken a critical line about the Epstein files. And neither of those positions has suited Trump. So Trump launches an invective against Massey. And he swings the opinions and popularity of Massey almost overnight. So he has got power in that regard. But when it comes to the important parts of policy, I regard the sitting US president as a powerless person.
And what is the extent of the threat that you feel is posed by? And I'm asking this with some knowledge of how you do think, but for my audience, on the one hand, you mentioned Palantir, the Peter Thiel backed panopticon, but you also, I know, harbour doubts about just how, or you're certain of the way in which artificial intelligence has been oversold, both literally and metaphorically. So how do you bring together your perceived threat of the likes of Palantir, and yet clearly you think that we're being encouraged to be frightened of something that ain't all that?
I suppose a question mark outstanding for me is to what extent the elites believe their own stories. And so for me, the potential of these large language models that are the AIs that we are served up with at the moment is grossly overstated. There's no sign at all of, and there's no theoretical possibility even of these models reaching the so-called singularity where they surpass the intelligence of human beings. And in fact, I think it stops well short of that. They have no potential to become creative problem-solving engines. And in this regard, they will never even come close to human general intelligence. And I think that this feeds into another sustained talking point of mine, which is that the problem with centralization is that it doesn't solve the problems of complexity. You don't solve the obstacles to beneficial centralization by collecting more data or analyzing it more quickly or running it on faster chips or anything like that. That doesn't solve the inherent problem that we are faced with when it comes to complexity. And the only environment in which any progress can be made is one that affords freedom, which requires a large degree of decentralization or subsidiarity. I believe that there are at least millions of the parasitic elites who have dwelled with the fantasy that this time is different because AI will be able to marshal this complexity and do beneficial things. But they're wrong. They're severely mistaken in this kind of perception. But it does leave the question of whether the parasitic elites who call the shots are aware of this intellectual catastrophe that holds forth this idea that there's promise in centralization and administration by artificial intelligence. I suspect that they know that it won't, and it's rather an exercise in willful destruction. And so that's where my concern lies, that there will be an attempt to centralize, to implement a panopticon, to censor even more, to institute various types of social strictures, such as social credit systems and digital IDs and central bank digital currencies and so forth. And that the attempt to do so will lead to catastrophic outcomes. But I wonder whether the elites want those catastrophic outcomes and instead have a mistaken belief that they will be able to control them. I do not think that they will be able to. I think the result of trying to centralize the world's processes on so many dimensions will be catastrophic in chaotic ways. It'll not have predictable outcomes, and some of the deleterious outcomes will fall heavily upon those elites. So that's kind of the structure of my thinking. AI is a false promise. Centralization is an unobtainable dream insofar as it encouraging the flourishing of humankind is concerned.
At the metaphysical level, do you? I know you're a proponent of the unique human ability to problem solve. Do you think the way in which AI is being both developed, financed, marshaled, and perhaps most important of all, pushed and propagandized, do you think that has a stifling effect on the problem solving potential of the human? Or do you think, on the contrary, that in defiance of this centralization and the pushing of the machine age, do you think actually it will be we could see an unexpected flourishing, a determined, defiant flourishing of problem solving in the face of it?
It's a very interesting question, and the optimist in me would hope that the latter is the case. Will it divert resources away from generative or creative problem solving? Almost certainly. Certainly, we are seeing a massive misallocation of capital, and that is structural. To increase the degree of complexity that these models are trying to marshal requires exponentially increasing energetic provision. You need to be crunching, in a much more networked and complex fashion, and those energetic demands, we're up against them, and I think, practically speaking, no further progress with the algorithms that are available is possible. We've basically reached the end of the road, and the end of the road is a pretty sorry state. Very little can actually be done productively with these new tools. And so there's a misallocation of capital, and I think also a consequent misallocation of human efforts. People plugging away at these AIs, thinking that they're generating creative responses to problems, when all that's happening is they're not close enough to the problems in the relevant field, and so they misinterpret the average of past human thought in that field as something creative or original. And so there's a potential for it to constitute a vast time sink that drains from human capacity for creativity.
I find it one of the things I find frightening, but don't take too much by by the general meaning of when I say frightening, but as you say, the energy consumption that these data centers and these technologies demand, we I don't think anybody thinks that we're anywhere near being able to meet them. And there's the fantasy of quantum computers and the quantum compute and how it's going to break through SHA-256 and the rest of the the securities around cryptocurrency and all of the rest of it. I mean, obviously, and that's without going into how much it exposes the vulnerabilities of, say, the technology in Taiwan. So one place is this critical hub, for something that's so intrinsic to all of the technologies that they have in mind, and furthermore that, as I understand it, the US economy, which Donald Trump is bragging about, is held up by six AI companies, each
Well,
of
the
which
markets are.
is bleeding the others white, to make itself look big and strong. And then after a period of time, that same blood is circulated back to one of the other five or six to continue the optical illusion.
Yeah, look, I think it's a mistake to conflate the markets with the economy. They're distinct things. And it's correct to say that the markets are dominated by these the tech behemoths. But and there is, of course, a real world economic aspect to the industry and a lot of misallocation of fixed investment taking place. And the analogy I like to use to illustrate why this is so is I like to just talk about a word processor. I got this idea from the physicist David Deutsch in one of his books called Beginning of Infinity. And he lays out this idea that, well, imagine that you have a word processor circa 1984, one of those blue screens with white text and everything done by the keyboard and so on. And you took that piece of software from 1984 and put it onto a supercomputer and had people type into it at a lot faster pace than it ever happened before. To make the claim that your word processor was somehow a better word processor simply because you were feeding more information into it and running it on a faster device would be quite ridiculous. The algorithm, which is the software code that is the word processor, if it hasn't changed, then your word processor is no better. And the basic algorithm of these AIs is to average over the language structure of things that other people have written. And doing more of that averaging or averaging faster is not going to suddenly generate creative thought. We don't know what the algorithms are for creativity. We've never been able to describe how humans indulge in this uniquely human performance of creative problem solving. That we don't even have a clue. There's not even a basic theory or a suspicion of where it comes from. Every now and then you'll get some half-wit philosopher waving his arms and talking about pattern recognition or something like this. But there's no specific suggestion for how the recognition of patterns gives rise to creative problem solving. That's an unsolved problem of philosophy, specifically of epistemology or the theory of knowledge. And I can't believe that these AI bosses, the Altmans of the world, are not appraised of that reality. I suspect that they actually know it and that they know that their technologies are not going to produce an iota or a smidgen of the progress and utility that they have been promising markets and the public.
I'm always drawn back to the sensation that I've had myself, and you will have had it too, I'm sure, where you're in company, you're sat around a table with friends, and maybe wine's flowing or whatever, but you're in company, and you will hear yourself say something, deliver a line that makes the whole company fall apart. Everyone laughs at the perfect line that you've just uttered, but if you were actually being honest with yourself, you would know that you had no idea where that came from. It was on your tongue
Yeah.
and out of your mouth, really, before literally before. It's happening faster than thought.
Yeah.
And the very idea that we know where just a great line comes from, far less the sort of inspirations that have come down through the millennia and down through the centuries, upon which, hinges upon which the whole door of reality has swung. How we could possibly imagine that was going to be simulated just by making a faster computer.
No, absolutely. And I think 90% of the reason we laugh is not so much because the content is funny, but because we recognize that creative spark behind it. That sort of, we see an utterance or an idea that we've never heard anybody come up with and have never come up with by ourselves. And the genius of that spark shines through, and it makes the story uh, funnier than it would be if it was just a banal observation that we've heard before. So we sort of intuitively recognize that spark, and it's, history is littered with stories of how great intellectual innovations are often accompanied by prosaic circumstances or events. Apples falling from trees, the water being displaced in a bathtub. These are all examples of thoughts that preceded some significant philosophical or scientific observation. So we have a real intuitive understanding that it's a bit of a dark. There's a void, an intellectual void when it comes to our ability to understand where intellectual innovation comes from.
To 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 move on somewhat further into the content of the speech that you gave last month, you have a section headlined "The Rogue Intelligence Community,"
Yeah.
and I have seen you suggest, let's say, elsewhere, that the intelligence entity, might be approaching, I think you call it escape velocity, where it might actually be, or may already have, broken free from any kind of constraint, national, even supranational, that it has become just an entity in its own right. And I think, and you do mention the fact that it's a coming together of the entities that we have understood as the CIA, MI6 in the UK, and the Mossad in Israel have come together, particularly as a three-headed hydra of the sort you describe.
Yes, it is a very disturbing history to investigate. When I've looked back into the prehistory of the CIA and the organization that preceded it, the OSS, there's quite a lot to show that the actual origins of the spy organizations were very entangled with criminal or with organized crime. So the mafia and the trade unions, which were already a sort of two-headed hybrid in the 1930s in America, they were part and parcel of the story of the very origins of these cryptic organizations. And so I think that the escape began almost from day one. And it's also interesting, I mentioned in the talk the story of Operation Gladio, which is the tale of how the US military left tens of thousands of operatives in Europe after the Second World War, and how those operatives went on to commit many false flag terrorist events, including assassinations of a sitting Italian prime minister and train station bombings that killed hundreds of people and so on. And I invited, when I delivered the speech, I invited the audience to check on Wikipedia, just to search for Operation Gladio while I was speaking, because what I've encountered is when I've mentioned it to people, they don't know about it. There is this CIA-controlled, CIA and Department of Defense controlled terrorist entity waging constant battle against the populations of of civilian Western Europe, and you know, basically acting to disrupt regimes and to polarize societies. And if that isn't criminal, what is? But it is, that causes me to ask the question, well, then why did this 1990 event of George Bush Sr. getting up on stage and telling the world that he had shut Operation Gladio down, why did that take place? And I believe it's wrapped up in this escape velocity theory. By then, the CIA had become completely adept at running its international affairs through very glossily clad cutout organizations such as USAID and the National Endowment for Democracy, or NED. And these organizations were given this gloss of supporting poor countries and helping with the development of democracies and just laws and so on. Whereas in reality, they were really about being plugged into the country's executive branches and ready to destabilize them when they stop behaving themselves by the lights of these criminal and rogue intelligence communities.
I've followed the work of Whitney Webb, Mike Benz, and others who've dug terrifying burrows down into all of this stuff. You know, Whitney Webb's book "One Nation Under Blackmail" goes, as you say, tracks the OSS back to an unholy union with the likes of Meyer Lansky. You know, where government organisations were tapping the know-how of organised crime because they wanted them first and foremost to perpetrate and commit acts that they regarded as being untouchable for themselves. But I think as you say, the very idea of encouraging an audience anywhere to contemplate something like Operation Gladio it's so eye-opening when you go in there and you look at people like George F. Kennan and his policy of containment. And that led, I think that was certainly in the DNA of what became Operation Gladio. And I think, actually, tragically for him, he certainly professed later in life. I think he lived to be about 102 years old. But by the end of his life, he was upset, let's say, by the evolution that had followed from whatever it was that he had set in train at the end of the Second World War. But also, I think it's in your. Is it in your? I think it's in your speech. You mentioned Victoria Newland,
Yeah.
and John McCain and the likes, who were there in Maidan in Ukraine, cheerleading for the regime change that then unleashed the hell that's still unfolding in that benighted place until this day. And yet, despite the long story that this is, back to at least during the Second World War and up to the present day, and yet it's still possible for someone like yourself to speak in a room full of informed and interested people and mention Operation Gladio, and it still in 2025 be the first time they've heard of it. The void, the distance that lies between the general population and necessary knowing is still vast, no?
Yeah, you could see people sitting up in their seats as they were listening to me at the beginning, and I slotted the Operation Gladio story and the invitation to look at Wikipedia into the early part of the talk, and you could see them all sort of picking up their phones and having a quick look, and then a couple of people started sitting up in their seats. That was a bit of an eye opener for them, and what was particularly interesting about this situation is I'd suspected that in my sort of impatience and desire to deliver at least one speech where I wasn't standing there with one eye on the Overton window and trying not to look like the crazy guy in the room, that I'd lose my audience. But that audience that sat there listening to the story of criminal and rogue intelligence communities and of a financial establishment that supervenes over a great deal of essentially financial oppression and cajoling or inducing activity that forces governments of many countries to behave in certain ways. Having heard that whole story, that audience voted for the best speaker and elected this talk as the best talk of the seminar. I was completely taken aback. I really was not expecting that outcome. And I thought long and hard about it. And I had a great number of conversations with audience members afterwards. And I was pleasantly surprised how this room responded to these ideas and was willing to engage with them. Now, granted, the conference attendees were of a libertarian bent. But if you think back to the COVID phenomenon, the libertarians were one of the most disappointing factions of society when it came to swallowing the government narrative and going along with the fear propaganda and the ridiculous story of the novel deadly virus and its consequences. So something
Yes, you mean
meaningful has changed.
I would certainly. I have my optimistic days where I think you're right, and I do experience more and more days like that. Although it comes with the corollary of thinking that, the thing about the cornered animal. I think it will. I think the thing that may be more and more at bay will become more and more desperate, and we may even be seeing that unfolding, around us this very day. Events that are continuing to unfold. But you mentioned George Bush Senior, HW, seeming to do something about Operation Gladio, but then how many people in your audience would have known about his dad, Prescott Bush? How many would remember that he was part of the so-called business plot, which was a fascist coup attempted and thwarted by Smedley Butler, who rather than becoming the leader that they had nominated him to be, effectively turned them in. And yet Prescott Bush goes on to father one president of the United States of America, and then his grandfather to George W. Bush. The
Yeah,
way the amnesia that prevails that causes us culturally to not know anything that's just over the hill in history is staggering.
yeah, and then you remind people that George Herbert Walker Bush was for a while a director of the CIA before he became vice president under Reagan, and that when you remind them of that, it's sort of, oh, okay, yes, I'm starting to see the picture. Yeah, there's definitely a dynastic element to the multi-generational rollout of these ideas that we can cluster around such concepts as the New World Order or the Great Reset, and numerous subsidiary theories like overpopulation and pandemic preparedness, and there are a great many of these things. But there is a dynastic element, and it's quite impressive how I'd love to get a sociologist's view on what it is they put into the infant milk formula of these successive generations that gets them so sharply schooled in the theories of technocracy, of centralization, and of global technocratic control. Because you can see in some cases, if you look at the Rothschild family, for example, you can notice the thread running through 4 generations. And by the time you get to the 4th generation, you've got 5 or 6 family members all looking after a corner of the technocratic vision and promoting it through their foundations and bequests and business activities.
Now, you mentioned there your sort of trepidation to some extent. That far from as you were being nominated as the best speaker, thinking that you'd be an object of suspicion, given that you were opening the Overton window wide. I would have imagined that the bit you might have been most trepidatious about was the Bank of International Settlements. Once you get into that terrain, the money power. Banking, full stop, is a very trepidatious area, and how did that go over? When you began to to illustrate, because I find, not that I don't, I don't move in financial circles at all, but when I mention the Bank for International Settlements, it draws a blank 99.999% of the time, even now.
Yeah, the Bank for International Settlements is definitely not a household name. I'd give it less than 1% of the human population who's ever heard of it or knows what it is. But it enjoys a great many privileges. The officers of the Bank for International Settlements enjoy diplomatic immunity. There's no way in which they can be searched by any organ or institution of law enforcement. And there's basically no method for disciplining them in any fashion or bringing them to justice if they do something wrong. And many people, when they hear the detail of that, are skeptical and need to go and do their own research to verify what you're saying, because they can't actually believe that that's how the system works. And it's also quite interesting how opaque the control structure is. Ostensibly, it's the members of the world's central bank who provide the organization with its guidance. But that couldn't be further from the truth. There's definitely a control structure above this. And that's where things become incredibly murky. And it's why I saw these two pillars, the financial control structure that sits above the City of London and the Bank for International Settlements, and this kind of merged intelligence community organism. I put them as two pillars, and I asked the question, are they merged at the top? And answered it by saying, I think there's enough evidence that they are. But it gets very murky. You see the same names come and go, and suggestions of power and influence, but it's very hard to work out exactly how these capo organizations, if you like, supervene over this interlocking magisteria, all the councils for foreign relations, the Atlantic Council, the World Economic Forum, the Bilderberg Group, the Chatham House, Fabian Society. There's this long list of interlocking organizations broadly heading in the same direction and looking after different elements of the puzzle. But they are brought in line, and members who stray from the flock are disciplined, expelled, ostracized. All of these things happen, and you get the anecdotes from such people who might, somewhere along their path through an organization or up its ranks, object to something they're seeing or realizing for the first time. How quickly somebody pulls the ripcord or the ejector seat, and they find themselves flying out. Those people will tell you sometimes quite comical stories about how trivial their infringements might have been. The question they had asked that led to an incredibly swift and violent kind of response. And it's suggestive of a hierarchy that is much more ossified than I think people want to believe.
Yeah, I mean, in line with your questioning about whether or not the two pillars come together at the top, you mentioned Carol Quigley, who's a name that will be familiar to anyone who's dug a little bit. I mean, I have actually put this there as a plant, but I mean, I've got the doorstopper that is Tragedy and Hope sitting at the top of my book pile at the moment for other reasons. What makes me think that they meet at the top is because Carol Quigley was the insider's insider, and he wrote from within the belly of the beast. But I think what upset the people for whom he was holding the pen, I think what upset them was that he made it plain that he didn't think they were wrong. He didn't have a problem with the central thesis of control and the approach being taken to world governance. He didn't see that. He didn't think that it should be secret. And that was his problem. So the fact that he didn't think there was any reason to cover this up, I think suggests, there really is something there.
I mean, I have a theory, I don't like this notion of people being on the spectrum, but I have a theory that Carol Quigley was way out on the spectrum and kind of like a little bit sort of autistic and systems thinking himself. And so he thought this plan looked wonderful. It looked completely logical. If he'd thought about it long enough, he might have come up with it himself. And any reasonable person out there reading about it would say, oh, this is all well and good. and so he trotted out and revealed much more than let's say the the more criminally minded architects were comfortable with. And there's a very spooky story of what happened to the efforts to publish the book, and how it eventually came into the public domain. It now circulates for free, and it's definitely worth dipping into, or reading a few chapters at least. As you say, it's a bit of a doorstop, but it is very revealing and quite comical, the way he sort of blandly states these facts and doesn't feel the need to defend them in any way. And you get this feeling that he expects that the reader will think, "Oh, this is wonderful stuff."
There is
And that's how it came to be.
for those that don't have the time maybe to plough through it, there is a tragedy in Hope 101. I can't remember off the top of my head the name of the author, but it is out there. I think it's actually a PDF that you can download, which cuts through and delivers this top line headline statements in a much more readily consumable product. You mentioned also in your piece, the sinister story, frankly, of the injectables that were rolled out after we were taught the word COVID and SARS-CoV-2 and all of the rest of it. And yet, here in the UK, and we've got politicians going on social media saying that the threat of flu is such that we need pop-up vaccination centres in pubs and churches and car parks, and the COVID, the anti-vax conspirators have to be dealt with head on, so that even after what we're saying here, all that the information that you detail in that speech, and it's a 5-minute read for anybody that that wants to go through it. Here we are again, 4 or 5 years later, and the lockstep determination to stay on that same path. Masks are back. We've got, I'm seeing more face masks on faces. Will we ever bridge the void?
So it's very interesting, because it does seem to be rather a United Kingdom phenomenon this time around. So this slightly novel deadly
Oh,
virus
great.
apparently obeying diplomatic borders. But certainly here in South Africa, okay, granted it is summer and that's not respiratory illness season, but there's not a word about it in the media. And we have the same Soros-dominated, mouthpieces for the establishment as any other country does. But they're saying nothing about it. So the memo has obviously got to them. Listen, don't pick up on this story of the flu in the UK. The South African population isn't ready to hear another episode. That there's too much mistrust, whatever the case may be. And I really think that in South Africa, if they even attempted to talk about another contagious illness that everybody should be hiding under their beds from, I just think it would fall completely flat. So I'm watching this development in the UK with kind of macabre interest. I mean, it's clearly ridiculous. It's clearly the same structures trying to repeat part of an old tired trick. But what they're attempting to achieve or test, I don't know.
Well, maybe it's not just Britain, though. Maybe it's Europe. I listen to a lot of commentators who are seeing a particularly unhappy spotlight focused on Europe at the moment. I mean, unhappy from the point of view of the native populations living in these countries. It does feel very much in Europe that the desperate sort of psychopathic parasite class are seeing fewer and fewer options and hammering away at the idea that we are at war with Russia, that Britain is at war with Russia, and that European countries, if they aren't already, will shortly be at war with Russia. And they're using language up to and including, we have to expect war on the scale that our grandparents and great-grandparents endured. And we're hearing this from public servants. How do you read it?
Well, it's a completely ridiculous contention, and I don't think there's a serious thinker in the world who would go along with the contention that Russia presents a threat and has territorial expansion ambitions in Europe. I mean, Russia is, for the most part, an empty country. It's sparsely populated, has very poor internal communications. The Rus tribe was once an expansionary phenomenon, but it expanded into pretty much uninhabited territories like Siberia, and where it did run into other large polities such as the Mongols, even those were fairly sparsely populated and not very attractive tracts of wilderness. So yes, there was a period in Russian history that involved territorial expansion, but modern history, the last two, I mean, and by the way, we're talking there about the reign of Ivan the Terrible 500 years ago, half a millennium ago. Over the last couple of hundred years, it's always been the case that it has been Europe as the aggressor, launching attacks into the Russian heartland.
Three
Russia
times.
has never, yeah, at least three times. And Russia has never been the aggressor, and it's very hard to see a motive for anything other than what Russia has always claimed it has done, which is in this invasion of Ukraine, which is to secure its borders and to protect the ethnic Russians who were really beset upon by this artificially installed and propped up Western-oriented regime. Which takes us back, of course, to the story of the CIA and Victoria Nuland and John McCain and the Maidan and the Orange Revolution, and decades and decades of relentless pressure that any sensible commentator would have said was guaranteed to provoke a Russian response, and did. But this idea that other European countries are at risk of Russian territorial ambition is one which no serious intellectual or historian can support, and you can just write off anybody who's behind that idea as bought and paid for by the establishment.
Do you think, in that note, do you think we'll see imminent regime change in Europe amongst the cornered regimes in Germany, in France, in Britain? Would you be imagining and forecasting any abrupt changes in any of them or all of them?
So I have an intuition that the toppling of the government in Bulgaria was not a result of an intelligence community-driven color revolution. I think this one looks as close to organic as any toppling event I've ever studied. And I did put the request out on social media, for people who are in Bulgaria and plugged into political structures, analysts of that part of the world, to please let me know what they thought the driving forces were. And I asked the question whether dissatisfaction with EU and NATO orientation was a driving event. And the thing that had spurred me to ask that question was that I noticed a really weird pattern to reporting in Western media about this event. And they said it was all about the corruption of the Bulgarian government. That's such a ridiculous thing to say. I mean, first of all, every government in Europe and the West is corrupt. That's nothing new. And Bulgaria has had a series of corrupt governments. That is not a sufficient reason to provoke this kind of fairly broad-based action. And other ideas are in the mix amongst, I would say, skeptics and dissidents, namely the economic ramifications of joining the European Union and the inflationary process spurred on by that. But it's very clear that the progenitors of this very organized mass movement had in their sights the Western orientation of that government. And I think that's quite an interesting event. Can we look forward to the dissolution of the European Union? Because I think that would be an extremely healthy outcome. I think it begins to come into view.
That's an ideal. That's an ideal. I think optimistic and positive thought. Straightforwardly put to end on. Nick Hudson. Once again, as I say, if I could, I would suggest to everyone interested to find the text of your full speech and to give it the attention that it deserves. I found it helpful. I've got it page marked for future reference. But in the short term, Nick Hudson, thank you so much for more of your time.
Pleasure, Neil. Thanks for the chat.